So Tom, I don't know where you want to start, but I think it'd be pretty cool if you could just share who you are, what you do, and maybe we can get a little bit of a backstory quick and just like some of our similar interests for people, and then
Yeah,
climate change and behavior.
just letting it rip. Yeah. So a little backstory. Basically, like everything you need to know, the most important thing is marine biologist. So I come from the sciences, but then I got into, well, everything that you're seeing here, all the cameras, all the gear of that. I really got interested in filmmaking and just making sure that I got to know how to tell stories. It's basically simple that I always had this thing in mind of like, maybe I should be doing more something towards the communication side instead of just doing research, full-on research. It never really interested me in a way that I'm not the guy to sit in a lab and just stay there and everything that they teach us at biology school. So that was like a first existential crisis that I had. Like, how the hell do I figure out what I want to do in the first place? So coming from the mindset of a biologist, it's really different to go into the creative arts. And I think that's something you know as well, Ryan. It's a different way of thinking. And in a way, you're a little bit freer. So you don't have to follow all the standardized things and all the standardized protocols that you have in science. But on the other hand, it's a lot more brain work in a different way. You have to be more creative. You have to think differently. So that really triggered everything that I was doing. So in the meantime, that I was studying marine biology, I got a GoPro camera. I got into the camera side. Then I started a YouTube channel, which was my creative outlet, just to play with different film styles, play with different techniques, and that grew a little bit. So I thought, like, let's just try this. Got into an internship for a film production house. They were probably thinking, like, what the hell is this dude doing here? I came rolling on with a skateboard, like this hat, full YouTube mentality. So that was a little bit different, but I got to know like different ways of communicating again. Like, how do you set up a nice shot? How do you light yourself nicely? That was all interesting. And then you get to a second existential crisis and you're thinking, well, now I'm doing all these videos for IT and all these corporate business things, but is that really what I'm supposed to be doing here? Is that something that's meaningful? Am I going to be doing this for the rest of my life? So actually this was all during Corona, so I'm skipping a few years here, but during Corona, I got like this real insight of, we got a pause button right here. Like, our lives are now paused. What am I going to do, and where do I want to be heading? And that's basically when I started up thinking, how do I do something about climate change? Not just take it on entirely, because that's just stupid to do that alone. But like, how do I set things in motion that at least I can touch some people to also start doing something for the climate? Basically, then Creators for Climate just was born. I'm doing that with a couple of friends that I know that they also have like a little bit of a science background. They have an engineering background, so they know how to think as a scientist. They understand how important it is to have facts, how important it is to have all these things as obvious truth. Something I also want to get in later on the talk. But they also understand like what it is to communicate on social media, because that's like a whole behemoth on its own. Not only for scientists, but like everyone who wants to do something on social media. So now we're trying to bridge that gap between science and culture, as we always say it. It's trying to get the scientists to empower them, not only scientists, basically experts on whatever field they are interested in or what they're playing in. So even like for behavioral analysis and climate, everything. We get those people together with creators and we link them up, hopefully in a way that we get them together to do projects on their own, like without us being the middleman, but just to get the ball rolling of like, we need more than just fake news on the internet. We need real news. We need real things that need to show that things are happening. And also because like we have about 10 years left. That's something that I said in one of those videos, but it actually is true. We have like just 10 years left before the things get too far out of motion. And then to put it nicely, I don't know if you can swear here on podcast, but basically then we're fucked. So I think that's like a small thing of everything that I'm doing, juggling a lot of things, but Creators for Climate is basically the thing that I'm doing right now, which also gives me purpose in a way. You know, you're doing something that's more important than just what you're doing. And basically that's it.
That's awesome. And that's what I had put together in my understanding of it too, to connect the dots for viewers real quick. I ran across, I think, the science community, and I saw some of the posts and things that were involved in that Instagram handle. And then I know a good friend there, behavior analyst Dia Ascari, has gone out and tagged me in a number of things. And I saw some of your stuff. And then I realized that both of us were interested in science communication after you were posting in Matt Diavella's Inner Circle, like a Slack group for this big YouTube creator. And so it's just like time after time after time, it was like, man, Tom's doing some amazing stuff. We need to talk. I also like bought a GoPro out of, being interested in how to start communicating behavioral science, just a different field, but same sort of things. Since ditched it and ran into all the same things, right? Like, how do you start to light and how do you create opportunities? And I actually make part of my living off of the type of work that you were talking about that you're trying to transition out of. So there's just like so many parallels here that are really interesting. I had a direct comment about the Occupy Mars shirt, and I wore it just because of the juxtaposition of what we're going to be talking about today. Of taking care of our own planet, but wanting to go to another one.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane. So we can hop wherever you'd like to. I know on the docket is sharing a little bit of, from my perspective, the behavioral science side of things, and then understanding, I guess, some of the data information, things that you think about. So you want to start there, maybe?
I'm just following you on this point, and I'm going to hop in. Also, just for people to know here, like I said, I come from a marine biology / biology standpoint or viewpoint. I don't know that much about behavioral science, like just what we've been taught in school at university. But I did like some research into some topics, but I've been like mainly going into climate change and everything that's regarding that. So I think that would be like the counterpart, just bouncing off some things, some ideas. And I think that's like where the interesting thing is, like, how do we think about it and can we learn from each other? Basically, that's like everything that I'm doing. So
So I can preface real quick, just a couple quick things to start us off on how we frame and understand behavior. Like, what is that term? When I say behavioral science, it's there's a lot that kind of goes into that when it comes to behavioral economics, psychology, and I think things can like bleed into that. Specifically, the field I got into is behavior analysis. That was really put on the map as a result of like Pavlov, Skinner, Thorndike, and some people that were in psychology that were trying to understand just how do the things that we do day to day get influenced. The data / assumptions that are built in that field are that the environmental interactions, like our interacting with the environment, is where the formula is at.
Yeah.
And so one of the main things that's applicable to this would be we have a simple model that I can actually share. I just realized because it's on my desktop here. Basically, the way that we look at behavior is it's everything that an organism does. Straight up, down to single cell organisms, up to complex human beings like ourselves. But the interesting part, for the sake of like I think today, is to share 3 different levels in which it's influenced. One of those is at the individual level, which we look at that there's environmental variables that we call these motivation operations, things that affect how likely it is that you're going to engage in some sort of response, but also how valuable that turns out to be for you at the end of the day. And then there's antecedents, which we just talked about as these things that trigger the behavior. Make it actually happen. So you have to have both of those. You have to both have like the motivational variables in place, which for us isn't internal sort of things. There are things that can be arranged depending on the individual or the culture or their individual learning history. Like you can arrange those. You have to figure out what they are, and then you place them with the opportunity to engage in something, which is the antecedent that leads to whatever the response is of interest. And then we put a big heavy emphasis on, usually it's talked about as consequences. I have postcedent here, which is a little bit of a tighter way, I think, to talk about it, but it's just the events that happen immediately after the response. And we're usually talking immediately here. It doesn't always have to be, but it's usually the things that happen immediately.
Just
And so
because
this is what we would call.
you would then link it to the action that you did. That's why you call it immediately.
Yeah, so those usually talked about as like rewards and punishments
Yeah.
would be a more colloquial way to say them. But it can be anything good or bad when we're talking colloquially there. So that's the first thing. And this was actually broken down really nicely, I think, through Skinner in an article where he talked about levels of selection. So he said that you have your natural level, natural selection, setting the biological level, which is like something that we're taught that we're supposed to understand as behavior analysts, but get no training in. And we just say like, this is super important, and defer really to your field and others. And then there's that individual like learning level, which is can be conceptualized through what I just showed you. So you have your natural selection, you have your selection like within the lifetime of the organism, and then you have your cultural level, which is the side where I think is really interesting, and where a lot of the understanding still has to come for how to influence things like climate change related behavior, is in that cultural level analysis. And that's the part that everyone's trying to really understand. So those are our 3 levels of selection. I think that it's really fascinating and scary when you say something like 10 years left, because like the contingencies for survival that drive us day to day and the ones that we need to start to plan for like seem to be not in alignment. And that's the sketchy part.
It's the disconnect. And the issue is, well, I say 10 years, don't quote me on the 10 years, but it's also like a way to make sure that people get the urgency, because that's the way in communication, maybe that it actually helps some people see the light. But actually something, let me check here. I wrote it down, and also something, that's why I mentioned like it's the direct link between like what happened, what triggers it, and like what do you find after that behavior of, is it good or bad for me? We don't have time. Like just remember the times you were at school. Like if you got an assignment, when do you do your assignment? Are you a student who does everything like I get the assignment? Okay, now I'm gonna start and I'm gonna make sure I finish it a few days before to get everything okay. Or are you the student who waits till the very late, last minute, and then tries to do everything at the night before? And you get like, you have a different pointing system. For us, it would be like a 5 out of 10. I don't know how that translates, a D or a C, something like that. Like what kind of student do you want to be? And that's something that we also need to take into account. And we don't have time for everyone to start seeing the light in 5 years, because then we need to do so much to change what we're doing right now. And it's going to be too late. So that's the thing we have to think of. Like, I think I put it somewhere here. I had a nice sentence. It's like, who do you start with and how do you change their mind? And how long is it between you get enough minds changed and the actions start to follow? That's something we also need to think about in our communication, because, well, we can say like we need to do stuff and we need to act upon this. But when is the communication coming into the individual? So that's where I look into behavioral science, because I think that's where, and maybe where not enough people have been talking to you guys, or at least that's something you need to tell me. But like, how many people do you interact with regarding climate change?
That's a super good question. And so what I'm going to try to do here is kind of break down what I've gathered on the understanding of how behavior analysis as a field has tried to attempt to like approach this. I'm going to pull up a couple quick notes here so I get some things right. First of all, so I don't know, I'm going to throw a few things at you there and hopefully answer this as a result of everything. So the field's relatively young. We're talking about like 100 years roughly. And this started to become much more of an interest in the 70s and 80s when people started publishing some articles on there. And we're talking about very low numbers of articles. And just so you kind of see this trend, I promise to button it up at the end. But there was, in the 70s, 16 articles published within our field, 13 in the 80s. In the 90s, that actually dropped down into a total of only 4 articles. And then in the 2000s, we're sitting like 2000s up until I want to say 2014 or 15, it was still only 17 articles like within our small field. And so it's just one of this thing where the majority of them are like, hey, this is an unbelievable, unprecedented issue when it comes to human behavior that we need to be understanding. And it wasn't until the early 2000s where people started, in my understanding of this, start to pull together resources and start to work together. One of the biggest things that's been going on is looking at a number of different literature reviews on like what seems to be working.
Yeah.
And there's a website. They started conducting some literature reviews, like taking this and really starting to dive into what's going on. And they're still finishing them up. I've seen them presented over the last couple of years. And some of the like one of the findings, for example, is that they sampled like over 1,700 research articles that were trying to improve something related to climate change related behavior, but only 1% of those was actually set up in a way that it was like a controlled study.
Yeah.
The rest of those are all not like controlled studies that we can actually extrapolate from. And so there is just like an underwhelming amount of actual understanding when it comes to the behavioral side of this, but there's a lot of people like mobilizing. And one of the main things, if I can be so bold to speak on behalf of our field of behavior analysis, is like we are as a professional organization set up majority in like certain applications, which are actually helping people with neurological differences, autism related disabilities, and the professional infrastructure, starting from trying to even talk about things that are outside of those traditional areas like climate change doesn't even really necessarily happen. It's not built into our infrastructure at an undergraduate level, a graduate level, a PhD level. Like you can find mentors and you can find the few people that are doing things and you can work with them and you can actually like dedicate your life to it. But you're talking about handfuls of people here. Like it's pretty crazy. So behavioral science and behavior analysis, we want to separate those. There's a lot of behavioral science going on. When you look at like those 1,700 studies, but I think the trends for our field is we have in no way set up to be able to, even have enough people that are like some of the main people that publish on this, it's not their day-to-day job. They don't work in that sector. It's all their time after their full-time job because we just have not built that up. And we can maybe get into, I think that's where the private sector might be the way to go and hopefully has our ass at the end of the day. Because it doesn't seem that you can coordinate all the different things that you need to coordinate very easily, whether it's university programs, mentorship opportunities, proper training and the scientific process, when it's looking at all the different factors that are influenced there, when it comes to the economic factors, the political and policy angle is unbelievably huge in this, right? So I do want to give a hat tip, I guess, to end this quick segment on there's a number of researchers and things that I'll include when we put this out there that have been working on what they call the Matrix Project. And the Matrix Project was trying to look at and pull in all the different variables that are potentially a part of like creating what they call sustainable societies. A big part of that is climate change. And that analysis is still going on. There's a few articles out there on it. But the infrastructure is not there to like support that continuing. And I know when you're saying, a decade is what we have is like a rough timeline. The speed is just not there. Like our field is not going to be able to do that on a scale that is probably necessary, right? To where like folks like yourself could potentially tap into a community and be like, hey, we've got somebody that needs, a video on this, or looking for an expert on, this part of climate change. Like that resource just ain't going to be there, or it's very unlikely that person's to be found. So yeah, I don't know if that actually answered your original question.
It just got me like a lot of insight as well. There's a lot of stuff that you said in there. I'm just going to go over my notes because it actually goes into all of this. And that's the thing.
Okay, cool. So I'll shut up. Take the mic.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe that's also an issue from the science side. So looking at climate change from the science side itself, is science too slow to do something about it? Because we know climate change is happening. We know all the effects that it's going to do, but like you said, those effects or the behavioral effects on people, how does that go? Is science going to be fast enough to catch up with getting enough people involved? And then if you're looking at getting enough people involved, how do we do it? Do we do it from the bottom up, or do we do it from top down? Do we do it both ways, but different ratios? Like, how is that going to go? Because we can start looking at it at an individual level. Like, I think this generation, like the newer generations, our generations and the younger people, they're way ahead of the older generations in terms of like thinking about the climate, because that's what they've been growing up with. They've seen this on the news. They've seen this from all different angles. But we need more than those generations, because those generations cannot start the whole chain reaction that we need right now. So it's looking at how do we effectively communicate towards all the different levels in society and to all different generations that are within that society. Also looking at like, and that's something I've seen your video from Michelle Obama, which was really interesting to me, because you say like you have to have somebody who influences that division, a role model. How are we going to use the role models to do this? I'm just thinking of like, you can discuss all the ways that behavioral change is going to happen, but I'm more interested in like, what can we do now? Okay, we have all this data. What can we do now? And can we just do trial and error, see where we go along the way? Because maybe we don't have time enough for that. So that's also where the urgency comes in. And I think that's the main thing. And that's why I'm hammering on those 10 years, is just to have somebody, if I'm talking to somebody that the next day or sometime in the future, they see something regarding climate change, or they're talking about it with their families, and all they can hear is the 10 years. Because maybe that imprints a little bit of urgency within people to start thinking about something. And I can tell you, like, for example, I now have this Keep cup, which is like a reusable cup if you go out. Not that we can go out right now. But once in the future, I hope I can go drink some coffee and take this with me instead of using all those paper cups. But the moment that I started doing all of this research for Creators for Climate, researching into climate change, and you have to think, I'm coming from a biologist standpoint, I already knew some things, but like really diving deep into all of the things that are going wrong, the things that trigger it, the feedback loops, that's enough of a mind click for myself to really think of everything that I'm doing right now. Like, I was going over, do I need a new phone? Because, well, the new iPhone came out. It's an old phone. Do I just replace the battery, or do I buy a new one? Is it because do I need it for the communication side? Do I don't need it? It's all these stupid questions you start asking yourself, but because you're so in depth into the matter, you actually start thinking about those things. And I think that's just like a good first step for people to have. And that's where I think we have to go towards right now, so we can then scale up afterwards. It's something like, I don't know if you read the book, The One Thing.
No.
I forgot the writer. I'll post it somewhere or share it with you. But it's basically like, if you do something every day of the year, you're going to build so much momentum. Instead of if you do something and then a few days later you maybe do something and then a month goes over it. But if you keep doing it every day, you build a really big momentum. So I'm always favoring small steps over big steps. I don't care that they're going to build a new nuclear reactor with Bill Gates in China. Well, that's something we need, but like, how do we get there? What's the first possible step that we can take, and then see where we can go there?
That's 100% in line with how behavior analysts would approach the issue of changing any sort of behavior whatsoever. You would be looking at what are the small little things that we can start to do to build and shape that over time. So that's 100% in line with how we would approach these sort of things. And I think for anyone that understands the potential implications of climate change and can kind of like perspective take a bit, or like see into that future, right? There's an interesting area that is actually, there's a really cool book on it, Impulsivity, if anybody wants to check it out. It is extremely nerdy. It's only for the nerdy behavior scientists there. But they bring up this concept and really dive into how do we start to look at the difference between smaller short-term rewards, longer, more valuable potentially rewards, which I think is at the core of things like climate change. Now, this is also at the core of things like healthy behavior. This can be at the core of like I don't know, I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, but like your relationships and like friends versus, intimate partners. Like at what point do you like bring things up or not bring things up, like financial planning, like all of it has huge implications, right? And one of the main terms that we use to describe this is talked about as delayed discounting. And I actually have a image just for the sake of getting us on the same page real quick. So I'll edit this in a little bit better in post. But the way it goes, they just look at, what is the potential likelihood of behavior and you engaging in something, and what does that look like as we start to delay months along? And they get these different values set up on exponential scales of high versus modest rates of decay that happens over time. And I guess there's a few reasons that I bring this up real quick. First of all, that individual behavior of shaping day to day is extremely important. What the primary area of interest is for me of like this impulsivity and demand curves and delayed discounting behavior is that we need to understand how to influence those. And that's something that people are talking about right now in our research, but we do not have a great understanding when it comes to scientific community, at least in behavioral science, of exactly what are the various different parameters that we can control, and to what extent with the right consent and such to be able to move these sort of things. But what we're seeing going on unbelievably at different levels is that influential leaders, like we were talking about the last 40 years of the American political system, and you can even look at anything that's going on in social media, is that it's pretty clear that they are able to shift those curves for certain individuals under certain circumstances. So is it possible at a large scale? I think 100% anecdotally when you look at what's going on politically and what you see that's going on with social media. And like you were saying with science communicators or anyone on social media, right? Like people are learning how to use that to potentially do things like shift the demand. Like one that's super hot in the last like 2 weeks is the whole GameStop stock situation that's going on. You have a bunch of people that are on the internet using a platform trying to shift people's demand curves saying, hold longer, right? Like if we can all hold, there will be better outcomes in the long run. So like it's doable. And I feel like society's trying to figure it out. But yeah, there's still like a gap in our understanding of delayed discounting and how to shift it largely, for certain issues, including climate change, from my understanding. And there's not enough time to like probably walk this out over, 10 or 20 years of research. Like we need to start implementing. So I feel like, and I use that term feel purposely because like I'm unsure, but I feel like these social media companies might actually have some of the data that's necessary to say, hey, this is how you can actually influence behavior on a very large scale very quickly. And I hope that we can start to have some social responsibility going on there.
What I also think, like, where's a lot of data regarding like just getting the information out to the right people is within that creator community. And that's why I'm so hammering to get the creators together with the scientists is something like we're doing YouTube, One of the things on YouTube, which is the biggest pain in the ass, if we just say it like it is, no bullshit, because that's how I like to communicate, is a title and a thumbnail. If you make a video on YouTube, you can make the perfect video, but if your thumbnail and your title is not good enough, nobody's gonna click on it. But the ones who know how to do this, the Logan Pauls of the world,
the
Mr.
people, Beast.
The Mr. Beast, they're not always like Mr. Beast was a great example, like with the Team Trees. He is going towards more of that side of being a altruistic, helping other people. That's something that's core to his person. I think he's like, if you look at the person that's behind Mr. Beast, it's a good, normal dude. But you have other people where that's sometimes more questionably be in the way that they behave themselves. For example, mentioning Logan Paul, like, it can be a show, it can be an act, but like who is the person behind Logan Paul, for example? I'm just picking someone that I know like that a lot of people have some issues with. But on the other hand, they understand how to do this. They understand how long you can make a clip before people start clicking away. So they know how to exactly manipulate your thoughts when you're watching the video to make sure that you watch it until the end. Those are the people that we need to be on part of this and help explain that. But then you come to a different realm where it's selfishness in some regards. Like, how do you want to spill the beans? Because you're in a position that you actually know this, and it helps you, and it helps you keep on track and ahead of other people. That's a different conversation for a different podcast or whatever recording that we're doing here, Zoom call. But I do think like we have to look at those influencers and influencers in the broad range of the word. So it's not just influencers in social media. It's like you said with Michelle Obama, it's knowing where the people are. For example, even you as a kid, you as a son, you as a father, you as whatever, you have influence over your inner circle as well. And actually, that's something that we did a post on Creators for Climate, like looking at your inner circle. Did you ever have a conversation about climate change with your inner circle? Maybe that's a good question for you to have. Like, did you have a conversation about that within your inner circle?
So it's not, it's something that happens, and it happens as a result usually of like either a piece of media that I've seen on it recently, and like I bring it up, or it's something that's kind of stemmed out of political issues. Like there's a political take one side or the other that gets brought up, and then that leads it into a conversation. But it's one of those things where, like, reflecting on it now, I can have the conversation. Like I'm thinking back on conversations I've had with my father on it for literally hours sometimes when it just inadvertently comes up. And we can have them, but it's one of those things where, like, since there is no easy solution on like what to do, even if we hold a little bit of different perspectives, which we largely don't, but like, even if I'm talking with someone like that, like we still get to this point where it's kind of like this gridlock of like, well, that was a good conversation, but like,
what now?
Yeah, and can we, and is that conversation really furthering things? Like, what was the pragmatic value of that conversation? I think it's super important though, like having those individual level conversations seems to be what really brings together either like family units, friend units, and is essentially what we're doing right here to an extent. But it's also like how change happens. Like any grassroots movement requires that, right?
It's about people. And like still the best marketing is word of mouth, because you trust the other person and you trust the referral that he's making or she is making for that matter. So like you said, that's a conversation to have. And there's a good podcast. I don't know if you've heard about it, How to Save a Planet. That is literally one of those topics. Like, did you have a conversation? It was some kid who, I'm not that well into US politics, so I'm sorry if I say something completely wrong.
You're saving. No, it's all right.
It's even worse in Belgium, but that's, again, something for a different conversation. It was a son who was having this conversation with his dad, but his dad was one of the Republican Party, and he was totally against everything that his son was doing. And talking about climate change, talking about it doesn't happen, was his mentality that he had. But the more those conversations started and the son actually stood up against him, like, hey, it's okay that you don't believe that, but I'm going to be doing stuff within my life that is going to help whatever the outcome will be. And just through that grit and seeing that his son was like that, he started thinking like, what if I was wrong? Like, what if I was wrong? And that actually went into a total different mindset. And actually now they're starting to do these things together.
That's super cool.
That's why I think it's so important to have those individual conversations, because you can talk to the people. You probably have people in your family who are totally against everything that you're thinking, or at least in some point. Like, can you help them make that change into a better way of thinking about this? And then we come into the section of objective truths and personal beliefs. Something that, So to give it like a really personal story, my uncle recently joined the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is, I don't know how that's in with you in the US, but here in Belgium, like especially in Belgium, just to give like an overview, there are not a lot of really religious people. Like most people are not that religious. So if you then see somebody within your family go to Jehovah Witnesses, that's something that clashes. But also the mentality that they have regarding climate change. So that's the conversation that I'm having with my uncle. But it also trains me to have that conversation with other people. And that's also really important because you can do this once, but it won't be enough to train yourself in how to set up an argument, how to talk them, how to help them see how they should be seeing it, and how to overcome personal beliefs and to actually go after the objective truths that we have. Because, well,
Yeah.
those matter.
When I was in graduate school, I slowly through a number of mentors, like got to the point where I was reading on and still believe this, that like the perspective taking repertoire, as we talked about, like what behaviors comprise and like how do you take people's perspectives is like the absolute most important one that a behavior analyst could potentially study, because you can't understand the issue from somebody else's perspective that you're trying to help without like somewhat getting into their shoes. And you can't do it perfectly, but you can do things we've found to be able to do that. You're reminding me of this, that individual level conversation is where I get to practice those sort of skills. It's where I get to practice like asking the right questions in the right way to where it doesn't, piss somebody off, and it actually provides you with more information to understand where they're coming from. But also, it's a fine line of sharing your words just right to be able to get your perspective across as well. And the more I think about it now, like that individual level, I think is where I learn the absolute most on how to frame certain things. Like even in how I was pitching earlier on the way in which we understand the influence of like individual behavior with that quick graphic, like that has been shaped through countless individual interactions with people and like how I pitch that. I guess that's one of the things that attracted me into the science communication realm, videography, and these sort of things is like we need to figure out how to accelerate people understanding other people's perspectives. And if we can do that, that's how you can start to bridge the gap. And I don't know, like I some days I feel like I've figured it out, right? And I can like record something and like things work kind of well. And then other days it's just like complete shit. And you're like, nope, I don't have this figured out. I really think it's a blend, and I'm biased as hell on this, but I think it's a blend of, leveraging these areas of behavioral science that I kind of understand a little bit. And like you're saying, like getting the right people involved, both on the creation side and on the like on camera side, I would guess is how I'd say it. And then using that to be able to pump different contextualized, like appropriate stuff to all the different people that actually listen. Like I watched, I'm thinking back to Greta. The documentary piece that was, I think it's still on Hulu. And it was very clear, at least from my understanding, that the certain people that can potentially change like policy level decisions don't have the same rewards reinforcers set up that the people that are advocating for it do. And so it's just like such a disconnect there, where she was essentially being used as like a pawn, or like a, someone that was, that needed to be in the room for the sake of like making things go over smoothly. But those things weren't being listened to, right? So I don't know. I really hope the younger generation, man, wouldn't that be like a crazy story if like someone like a Logan Paul like decides to help educate on climate change?
I think like something that you said there is really important is, and that's what I've been trying to do just as a practical thing, not getting into the whole science of behavioral analysis, which is like trying to figure out on my own, which isn't scientific at all, I know, but having the conversation with somebody who is on the different side and understanding how they think, how they took all of their experiences into this belief that they have about the topic at hand. For example, I have a friend from back in high school, and now he is going into politics here in Belgium, but he is going in depth, and he made a remark on Facebook, the Facebook warriors we have today and all the fake news, different topic. He was talking about like how all the experts right now, and this is the same whether it's in Belgium, whether it's in the US, the experts, how he mentioned it, are controlling everybody. And it's the scientists who are now finally have their power over the people, and they're controlling everyone to do whatever they want. But it sounds insane coming from a scientific standpoint, like from that viewing point, but how do you get people to have those thoughts in the first place? Like, what experiences did they have to think those things? I've had multiple conversations with like younger people who are also saying these things, and then giving them the reasoning, like asking them, so what don't you understand about this? What, like, can I help you understand this in a better way? Especially now with the vaccinations, like, don't put any of these vaccinations in your blood. It's going to be bad and blah, blah, blah. Well, there's actually been like more research done about these kind of mRNA virus like vaccines than other things. So you have to have a conversation. You ask them like, what don't you understand about these vaccines? And it's like, yeah, they're putting a lot of metal in there. Okay, so the metal is used, like for example, the aluminum, it's used for stabilizing the product. It's less than all the aluminum that you normally get within your body, like even from a deodorant, for example. Okay. And then you see even within a Facebook conversation, like a comment section, you see people change their minds because they have access to education, access to knowledge. You can share, but it doesn't help when you're saying like, no, you're wrong. No, that's not the thing. Because what you have then is like, you have clash of opinions, and you would take your opinion and would even stand firmer because this is what I'm thinking and you're wrong about this. You can say that much. So that's a different way that we also need to communicate with people.
Super good point. That was one of the things. So there's these things. I'll actually send you this article because you can just read through the tables and it might be like a wealth of information for you. And it's actually designed super well. Like it's really palatable. They did a really cool research article where they looked at what they called behavioral kernels. And it's just like the minimum process that you need to be able to follow in order for behavior change to happen. One of those was this us versus them mentality. When you phrase things in an us versus them mentality, I think this was done in 54. Like we've known this forever. Yeah. When you do that, you just push people apart. It doesn't matter what the topic is. You could be talking about your favorite YouTuber. You could be talking about your favorite coffee. You could be talking about politics. That us versus them mentality. And when you frame things in that way, will push people apart. And what that does though, is like, it also like, it's like, I see it used in, media all the time to like drive clicks and those sort of things, right? So it's like this super fine balance on when do you lean and use that versus when shouldn't you? And like, it's also a crazy ethical moral question of like, should we even be allowing some of these sort of things that we know just drive people apart, you know, in certain forms of media or communication styles and such? Because we can see what the outcomes are. But it's also like, really scary to be banning, you know, certain types of speech and things like that, or like completely just not a practical solution. But we know that the outcomes of certain types of speech will do these sort of things. So I guess the two areas that I find super interesting that we can potentially leverage is just like how language works. That's one of the examples. And I really think that there's a lot of data that are potentially available in these social media platforms and other places to help kind of speed up what the science already knows, or like compare to what the science already knows on a larger scale. And then it is the how do you start to like shift, you know, people being able to look into the future, behave with respect to future incidences. Because I live along like an area, I'm only 6 miles, I think, from the California border. When California's on fire and the world knows about it, like it might not be that close to me, or it might be like literally 10 miles away, depending on what's going on. And just like this last summer, like we had a period where there's 3 weeks of smoke to the point that I couldn't go out and even go for a walk or run because those particles go through your N95 or N99 masks and like literally get into your bloodstream. Like you could feel that stuff hitting your bloodstream. And that for me is like that, whether that is specifically like that fire was a result of these sort of things. And, you know, like we can get to those details, but like experiencing that, if the world is likely to have more of that in the future, I want to start changing things now because that 3 weeks was hell. I guess and the interesting part there is like you have to come into the more you come into contact with the actual effects of what potentially is going on with climate, the more like you are to like change your behavior. And that's at that place that we're stuck in. Like how do you get people to experience, to start to motivate the potential change? And I really don't know, without a lot of the younger generations really passionate about it, just doing as much as they possibly can, like as much as they possibly can.
There's a quote from one of the podcasts that we already recorded for Creators for Climate regarding politics. So it's one of the co-founders of Creators for Climate. He used to be in the youth politics in Portugal, but he said something that was really striking, and maybe that's a way of communication that we also have to go for, is how much do you love your kids? How much do you love your your grandchildren? Are you willing to look them in the eye and say like, hey, I'm sorry, I just value my life a lot more than yours because, well, yours is probably not going to be as good as mine. And actually asking that question to people, we did it a few times now here in Belgium just to try like trial and error and see how people react to that. And then at first you see these people like out of context, like what is this question? But like once you start having that conversation, then people are like, yeah, of course I love my grandchildren. Of course I love these people. So it's also starting to get into the emotion and communicating within that emotional mindset. That's also important, I think. I don't know how that goes along in the behavioral science part.
That could be a strategy that would help people understand another perspective. So
yeah.
A proper way to look at something like that, if you had like all the potential resources, is you would attempt that sort of thing. And it's almost like a phase change line. If you're looking at the data points and you'd be like, okay, they were behaving here when we did that, like what effect did that have on the person's ability to be able to, all sorts of things, listen to other people, how much did it shape their perspective? How much did it, potentially make them not want to further engage in the topic? You look at a bunch of different things there and we kind of break those down. But yeah, that's it. That's a perfect example of how you would potentially start to influence somebody's perspective. Your take on the private sector is do we need to like lean on the private sector for these sort of things? It seems to be, when you look at something like SpaceX and what they're trying to do, right? I told you I wore the shirt purposely because it just kind of creates this weird juxtaposition. Look at it as like, man, that might be a way to potentially, allow the human species to survive and prosper forward, but also like, why aren't we putting every single ounce of energy, time, effort, cash into, something that like climate change that is 100% impacting us already and going to continue to escalate to impact us? So do you look to the private sector? And then I guess my other one was I wanted to allow Annie and Andy and others to potentially chat about some things.
Definitely.
If they wanted
just
to.
Hop on. I always love talking to other people. Just quickly about the SpaceX, the whole thing of like going to Mars. I think a lot of people, what they are missing or not thinking about is like we're still part of a natural system. We're still part of an ecosystem. So even though it doesn't feel like it now that you're sitting there and you have light hitting on your face, you have all of these things, we breathe air, we sit, we move around, we need all these things. Even like just seeing green, like studies have confirmed that if you see greenery, it just makes you happier. We're part of that system. So if you're just gonna take the human species, put them on Mars, you would have to develop a whole new ecosystem around you. How are you gonna do that if you cannot support the ecosystem that you're in right now? So it's not I don't think the problem of getting us there is the issue. It's like, how do we survive there for the long run without the same thing happening over and over again? Wait, come back to your first question, the private sector, right? There was something that you said there in the beginning of the conversation, like half an hour ago or something. I had this conversation with an entrepreneur here in the Netherlands/Belgium. And I think he had a really good point, is the private sector could actually be the one to tip the scale in our favor. Everyone has a business or works within a business. If you can set layers of policy, or at least set layers of different guidelines regarding everything that we do, sustainable development, you have to reach like a carbon neutral against blah, blah, blah. if companies made that promise to themselves to start doing that, we could get so far, because then you actually reach all of the people, at least the working people. But the kids, they still need to study and everything. So we have that. That's the entire people, like the entire population that we need to reach. So starting from the private sector, I think that's going to be the best bet. And that's also why I'm seeing it here in Europe, for example, that a lot of companies are putting, regarding the Paris Agreement, they're putting like quotas for themselves that are a lot higher than what, for example, the Paris Agreement states that they have to have, because we need to have better quotas than that. Otherwise, it's not going to be feasible anymore to stay under the levels that we're trying to stay here. So yes, private sector is the way to go, in my opinion. But then we come to another section, and it's like, how do you communicate to the private sector that they have to change? How do you use that? Who do you take as influence for those CEOs? Who do you take as influence for within a company? Like, is it a CEO? Is it someone from outside? So we have, for example, I don't know how you call it in English, the weather lady, like the weather presenter.
Yeah.
Here in Belgium, well, she used to be the weather presenter from one of the Belgian networks. She is now starting to develop courses to go to companies to talk about these things and trying to change the mentality of a company itself. So that's a different conversation to have, like the communication side of that. So basically it comes to that. That's why Creators for Climate is so important for me, is because we need to change the way that we're communicating. And that's what we're trying to figure out. Did you hear about the donut economy? Okay, so that's gonna be. That's gonna be. It's not my cup of tea, like directly. It's something that I've been getting into. Like, it's a different shift of how we look at things. Like, growth shouldn't be like. Why is growth the defining thing in the economy right now? It comes from that perspective. It's like, instead of having like, we have to grow everything, like there has to be more profit. We look at the economy as a donut, and all of the people who aren't included in the economy right now, they're in the middle of the donut. And we use our economy to get those people within the whole society and help them apart. But this is something I'm not specialized in this, and I'm just like, it just found out. But it's something that I think would be, let's just state this. If we want to have the change that we need to change the system. It's basically that. The whole mindset and the whole system of like, we need to have more growth. And the whole thing, like you said, we need to have a business plan that allows the big multinationals to keep getting money, even changing it up that we are doing good things for the planet. It's not, it doesn't fit together. Or if it did, we would have found it by now. I think that's my personal belief on that. It's not an objective truth. But it shows that something in the system needs to change. But that's also the problem, and that's where we have to look at behavior again. Like, changing a system on its own, like just changing your daily routines, that's even like just like trying to lose weight, It's difficult. Yeah. So how the hell are you going to change an entire system? So that's where people are starting to talk about this donut economy, and just wanted to shout it out here, just to see also like how many people actually know about this.
Oh, so this is it. I bought a pass to Sundance, the film festival, and there was a film there that was called Bring Your Own Brigade. I don't know when this gets out on streaming platforms. Go check it out. It's going to be somewhat, the typical climate change / fires in California and, in other areas where you're just like, you're learning some things, but you're also like bummed at the end. It's going to leave you on both sides of the fence there, I guess. But it was different from other ones. So look at the Woolsey fire and these other fires that were just unbelievable here in Northern California a couple years ago. And I guess this is known publicly, but I guess this is like a slight spoiler alert. Like, it's out there. I just don't know if everybody knows it. But what they what they highlight towards the middle and end of it is there's a number of things that we can do to be able to safely prevent certain types of things. And they have the assumptions there as part of this is climate change, part of this is policy, and part of this is other private sector things. Like it's a conglomerate of different things, which I really appreciated looking at a more holistic perspective. But they highlight how one of the towns there, when presented with all the information of like, hey, if we do these things, we could potentially be a safer society. This town just had 86 or 85, 86. I hope I'm not getting that number wrong. People that passed away from that fire like in one day. And fast forward a year later when they're like, sitting there as the town hall meeting's going, and they vote not just like to downplay a few of those, they downvote and don't pass anything in their town ordinances that potentially make it safer. 85 plus people just died in that area and not a single thing was voted to change. Like it was like I've been talking about, this, how do you start to shift demand curves and like people's choices. If you don't act like super quickly, like they showed that just like a year delay, there was enough people that were like, yeah, this is no longer, something that I'm worried about. Like I would rather have shrubbery, for example, within the 5 foot, perimeter of my entire house because I think it looks good than get rid of it because we know that actually helps prevent fires from growing. Like when embers blow into your shrubbery on the side of the house, it starts to increase the probability of your whole house going up. So it's like, we need these things to line up. Like we need the media, we need the science, we need like the timeliness of everything to line up just right. And I hope there's whether it's another Elon Musk that attacks it from a different angle, or if it's the ways in which you're approaching it, Tom. I think they're all like fully applaudable, regardless of the scale. Like we all need to be doing that. So I guess thank you for what you're creating.
Yeah. One thing upon that is something that I've been seeing again and again from people who are more knowledgeable about like what to do next and what we can do. If everyone just started digging into it, just one thing, like just pick a random thing about climate change, about any of the things that we can do to go against the tide that's coming, just go down a rabbit hole, research everything that you want to, and then pick a next one. If everyone, like we're a pretty big amount of people on this ball of dirt, if everyone should be doing that, then we would have enough minds triggered to at least get to the first stage. That's all we need. Just everyone should just go down and pick up a book, go to the library, do a Google search, and just starting looking into it. And like I said in the beginning, now that I'm doing this for Creators for Climate, I'm gonna tell you how many things I've been learning, what I thought I was doing right. So it's also about being open-minded enough and to allow yourself to be wrong within a moment. And I think that's also a really difficult thing, allowing yourself to be wrong and not always trying to be right. It depends also upon your personality, how strong your personality is. I know some people who are always going to be saying, no, I'm always right. But it's it needs to go in stages. You have different kind of people, different personalities that will trigger different personalities that will eventually envelop everyone that's well, probably not everyone, but enough people at least. I think I had something right here. That's something as well. Like I talked about the existential crisis in the beginning. I don't know if wait, Andy. Sorry, it's hard to not when you don't see all the names. I don't know if you heard that in the beginning, if you were here already. But like when you have an existential crisis, you think about like everything that's wrong with your life. You also have people who have been in like really, really terrible accidents, like really big traumas, and they thought their life was over and they get a second chance. What I've been seeing is like, I've been talking to more of those people as well. And what I see is like, that gives you enough mentality, enough mind shit. Sorry, my English is starting to dabble. It's like after 11.
I know it's late there. Yeah.
So it gives you enough of a mind shift mindset shift that it just recalibrates everything that you're thinking about. If you would just do your daily routines and you have to get up, you go shower, you go to the toilet like everybody does, you go to work, you come back, you're in that same thing, but nothing really happens. Then you get a smack in the face, just like with Corona, and you have to rethink everything. And most of those people that I have, and I've been talking about climate change, they actually see the gravity. They can see how quickly your life can change. And knowing how quickly that can change gives you also the state of urgency. And it comes back to the urgency side that we need to have with people. I also had this something like a little bit recently that I had some medical issues and also started thinking about those things. But unless you have those things, like if you haven't had those, it's really difficult to have that sense of urgency. So yeah, that's something as well, like what makes them think differently? What makes you think differently after you had such a mindset shift? How can you analyze that? And what can you learn from that?
That's an interesting one. I'm gonna have to look into try to dig around some keywords and try to see if there's like psychology research on that, because I agree with your premise there. And whether it's certain things that have like happened in my life, or I'm thinking about a couple of family members that had some like really traumatic things that happened. I can see like that works. It's like under what conditions, and like how could we harness it to help people without putting them through
the traumatic
shit that usually requires to be able to do that sort of thing. Like there's got to be a possibility there. It seems like you need it depends on the person, I think, on to what degree, but you need to be experiencing the effects, good or bad, whatever they are, to be and like get closer to that actual event. So if it's climate change, we need the things that people behave with respect to, like yourself, Tom, right now, that are like motivating you. We need to figure out how to harness those things and get them in a way to where other people can experience them, whether that's through media, VR applications, AR. Wait, I don't know what that is, but it seems like we need to create ways in which people want to opt in to those experiences. Because you're not going to force it down people's throats. It's going to push people apart, or it's going to have the opposite effect, right? Which I think is what we've seen partially with the issues in the U.S. specifically on this with our political system, is like you can't push it. Unfortunately, like you cross a threshold in which that doesn't work anymore. So you need to have like ways for people to opt in. The empathy thing, I guess I'll pause after this, is from behavior analytic perspective, your perspective taking skills lead to empathy, and they've started to be able to link that research. So you can build more empathy if you can get people to behave with respect to things. And the idea there is that you're just behaving with respect to something that is not in your immediate environment and potentially is from somebody else's perspective. So it doesn't have to be it can be behaving with respect to things that are not around you immediately, like your perspective almost extended as to like somewhere else or down the road in time, or it can be behaving with respect to somebody else's perspective, either in the moment or their perspective of like what the future is going to be like. We need things created there. I don't know where this will lead to, but you've got me really thinking about things that I need to start making now, like things I need to start making. So
that's why these conversations have to happen, man.
Yeah. Hey, Editing Ryan here. This was filmed on February 3rd. I'm now editing, a month and a half later in March. There was a really good conversation that was started from one of the people viewing this. You might not know as a result of the edit, but there were some people that were here listening and commenting throughout while Tom and I were discussing things. And I want to respect their anonymity, but this is a really important thing to bring in. So this is the question or discussion starts to shift around what happens when we have these like really short form communications, such as comment sections and social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And how can we get it to where we have lengthier discussions on topics? And the person that was viewing presented in its discussion or a viewpoint amongst them and a close family member that had really differing views, and the short comments would get them both upset and essentially, and they wouldn't dive in deeper. But when they did dive in deeper, they learned from each other. They might not agree on their perspectives, but they learned more about the varying perspectives than the one that they held. So with that context, jump back in.
People don't take time to listen to other people nowadays, especially on Facebook. Like, for example, something really, really stupid, and you can cut this out, but I just had a question about a camera, like about something on my camera, to just adjust the setting, which is like I have 3 almost the same kind of type cameras, and it's on 2 of them. On the other one, it's not. It's just like a wheel to change the ISO. That setting is not on there. So I go to a Facebook group, like we all do now, because forums don't exist that much anymore. And you just ask like, hey, did anybody figure this out? I got a whole list of people getting mad at me. Like, why don't you just use the other button? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? It's like, just asking, can you just tell me if somebody figured this out, or is it not a feature anymore?
What filmmaking group was this?
It's just about like the Sony A7C, just about that camera. But it also shows like, as the A7C is a beginner camera, you have a different type of audience right there. People who are not really into high level stuff, a lot of customizations. They don't know it exists, or just not maybe literate enough in this field of whatever topic that they're talking about. But it just shows like how worked up people can get. As somebody from Europe, I can say, looking at the US, it seems that it's just a lot worse over there. Like here in Europe, because we have so many different nationalities living really close together. Like I'm from Belgium, I'm good friends with somebody who's from France, which is like a different culture, but still we're part of this thing called Europe. So you allow yourself to live with these different cultures. Somehow I feel that we get across better than people get across with each other within one country. And like if you see it from the news, but then you also have like the bias of the media that show it, but like coming from the media within Belgium, looking at the US, you just see how much of a different mindset there is as well. Like people get really hard on Facebook, for example. And that group, why I mention it is because that's a group that's, I went looking at the people that were in that group and the people who were reacting, most of those were from the US. So maybe it's also like the mentality of the country itself, or like of a lot of people that needs to be changed. Not only the US, I mean, this can be like all over the place.
For sure. Yeah, no.
Just to give an example there, because you live there.
There was, I was traveling through about 3 years ago in Egypt, and there was a group that we were with that one of the gentlemen there, born and raised, left for a few years for his graduate studies over in Canada, I believe. And you could tell he's really eager to talk about something. And I was like, just, what do you want to talk about? Because we were just kind of bullshitting back and forth. And it took like 10 or 15 minutes for to convince him, like, I'm not going to get upset if you want to bring a certain topic up. Like, I don't think you're gonna piss me off here. And his thing was straight up like, do you realize that the downhill trajectory of what's going on in the United States? Like, do you realize as being a part of that culture, like the issues that your society was built and founded upon are also like starting to like pull you all apart and like crumble, the unity. I think that guy was so right. And I was potentially, I paid attention to some of it and I was kind of skeptical, I thought, but I've gotten so much more on board with like, holy shit, are we a mess? Like after the last 4 or 5 years, and especially last year with Corona, I don't put this stuff out there publicly. I had like so much of my day-to-day business stuff just get wrecked in March and April that I was just like, well, figure out how to survive. And then I guess I got a shit ton of time. I'm not gonna make money this year, but I'm gonna read. I read as much as I possibly can last year. And it is very clear that the way in which our Constitution is written and the things that we put in there that are extremely important are also like working against us. And like compound that with just the right economic setup and just the right class structures, and we're fucking doomed, man. like I don't like unless dude, unless Oh my gosh. Unless Biden, Harris et al. Can like do FDR level social reforms and like get us back on track and just like completely restructure shit, I'm super skeptical, man. Like we
But that's the point.
We-
We're just waiting, and that's not just in the US, it's in Belgium as well, and all Europe, everywhere. We're just waiting for someone or a group of people to just step up and have the balls to do it, to reform.
And what we learned is that the people that are most likely to do this are the insurrectionists that went storming the Capitol in the U.S. 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
That's the crazy shit, man. Is like, so for me, it's like, it's a really similar issue where it's like, what information, like what's actually going on with the situation, like what's influencing, how many people is it actually going to affect? And to what degree do we take it seriously? And I looked at like what happened a few weeks ago here in the US is like connecting the dots now, and I could be totally off on this, but connecting the dots, I'm looking at it as, you know, to tie it back into that conversation I had with that gentleman there, is like, he didn't know what he was predicting, but he could have said like, this is on your trajectory. Like, I think that's what he was having with me at that conversation, is like, hey, there's gonna be some crazy shit. And maybe it'll be that you have the right pieces in place in the military in certain places and the judicial system to like kind of combat it, or maybe you won't. and when I watch other documentaries and shit that's going on like Myanmar right now, other places that have had issues is shit. When I went to Germany and I studied, when I went to Germany and I walked through, study's the wrong fucking term there, but when I was like reading through the topography of terror, which is like this place there in Berlin that describes the events that led up to the Nazi regime. It's what was it? Hitler's 1933 attempt or whatever it was that failed. Like, holy shit! Like that might have been what just happened. It might not be the same person or the same party potentially, but like those things are so real, and we just like climate change, I guess. Like we just don't pay attention to them, I think, enough as a community, and it freaks me the fuck out.
You know,
freaks me the fuck out.
Actually, there are two things I wanted to say, like coming back about what you said earlier about having the conversations, and as well, like you not seeing that point from his perspective because you hadn't heard of it from your dad. There's like just, I remember a class I had in biology, which always stood by me, like everything that I'm thinking of. You can compare it to the helicopter view, but it's like, my professor said, you know, you have a small cell and you have all the cell organelles that the things that make a cell alive, you know, the DNA, everything, blah, blah, blah. Cells, they would form multicellular organisms. But the first thing, like within an organism, you would have the organs. Then you have the organism. You have different organisms interacting with each other. You have a population, a community. You go even further, you have the ecosystem. Then you have the biosphere. But what each separate cell does affects the biosphere in some way. So it's having the in-depth knowledge of like what cells do that is important, but it's also like zooming out and having the overview of everything that's happening. So the holistic approach to that. But that comes to what you were saying, like you have the green movements here in Belgium, like it's the same everywhere, but like we have to do more for the environment. Okay, we have to make sure that companies survive the shift to that kind of environment. That's true. We have to make sure that communities are all right, that we don't leave any communities to the side. We have to make sure all these things happen. So you do have to take into account that all these individual parts are working, but also that they're working together. And that's just where now the disconnect lays as well. Like you have media, and I can just talk from examples here. You have media talking about the experts, for example, now Corona, and they're putting the experts in the news, and you see these experts all over the news every episode you see something talking about, well, this is not good, this is good, blah 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 blah, then you have this mindset of like, why are these experts in the news? And then you have the people like the guy I told you about, who are thinking like, these experts are pulling the strings here. They're always in the news, being on the news. They have a place where they can say what they really think, but then that doesn't always streak with the rules and the way that companies work. Yeah, you can say like, don't go outside, stay within your home. But as a company, you need to make sure that money comes in. You need to pay your employers. You need to pay everyone, and you need to make sure that you have food on the table. How are you going to do that when you have to stay in home and not do those things? So those people would see that, they would get mad at the experts and don't trust them anymore. So that's where the disconnect lays. But that also comes to the media putting them in the news too much, because that's a nice way to get attention from the viewers. And it's this vicious circle that goes around and goes around and goes around. So if we don't get, for example, the media on the same line, it's not going to work. But if we don't get politics at the same line, it's also not going to work. So we need to, and that's where communication, hammering on that, where the communication is so important. That was a very bad explanation, but you get the point.
That's right. What you're describing and where the interrelatedness of all of this that you're describing is exactly where our field of behavior analysis end up. They call it behavioral systems analysis. Yeah. The idea is that you have to understand with how each of those nodes potentially works and influences under like their perspective and their environmental like circumstances. But then you have to realize the interconnectedness of them all. And so I'll make sure to share some of that sort of stuff your way. I'll share you like a summary of that sort of thing if you're interested in it. But that's I would say 5 to 15 like researchers and practitioners that are like really putting time into this in our field and like pumping out articles and like really trying to produce stuff. They've all realized like that behavioral systems analysis approach is how you have to do it. You have to be able to understand all of them. So it's one of the projects they're tracking out. They call it the Matrix Project. Yeah. And they're looking at each of those different nodes, trying to understand how they work. And then the idea is that they'll go out there, disseminate, and present this information to the people that are actually making the decisions.
We've been talking a lot about like the issues, the disconnects and everything. What would be your take on like the next step forward? What is the first step that we can take to not just research it, but to put it into practice? Like to know what we have in the behavioral side and how do we put that into practice? Knowing that we have to look at the small scale, but also knowing that we have to look at the zoomed out view of like the whole society as a thing.
Regardless of like what role you want to play, if it's having a conversation in an individual level with your family unit and friends and things like that, or if you literally want to be like the next entrepreneur that's trying to build the $1 billion or $1 trillion valuation company that's like solving some of these sort of issues, who cares what side of that you're going to be on? Like dedicating some time towards this, regardless of what scale that's at, seems to be the one step that everybody can do that'll start to make an impact and a change. Like reflecting on my own self, I've been trying to do this through just like consuming media pieces and trying to understand the perspective of like how big of an issue is this going to be. The next thing I could do potentially, which actually, because of the reading and prepping for this today, I was like, I need to build a mini series this year on the channel that's just like dedicated, talking with the people that are publishing in our field about this work and like sharing it out there. Mm-hmm. So I think that can evolve and change over time, and mine will potentially do that too. But the side that seems to be really missed from our behavior analytic perspective, not that the smart researchers have like acknowledged this, right? But the side where we need the most application for like the growth of this to be really exponential is figuring out how to build it into a business model, like Andy was talking about, like building into a business model that allows it to sustain and move forward. Like one of the most prominent researchers in our field works a day job that's completely unrelated to the field and the applications, but publishes purely under this climate change. Yeah. Like it could not be more of a disconnect on the two different applications that they're working on potentially. And that's because we have jobs set up for one and we don't have jobs and positions set up for the other. And so that doesn't mean that it has to be like everyone goes out there and creates their own company and like does their own thing. Like that's hard. Like we both do that to an extent, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not easy. It's fun, it's rewarding, there's cool parts of it, but like that's what's been demonstrated and argued for in the expansion of fields. And like there's been some researchers looked at as you build the jobs, like the practicum sites and the opportunities, like that is the beginning that allows the like sub specialties or, these to grow or prosper. And so I get it's a lot to ask and I can't be asking people of it, but like we need, especially from our field's perspective, like we need more behavior analysts that are like, this is an important issue. I'm going to create a business and opportunities around this that's sustainable in the sense of like it has money coming in, but sustainable and, in its own practices that creates more opportunities for other people.
Yeah.
And I mean, now it's probably never been the better time for that. There's a lot more interest in these sort of things. There's opportunities, at least in the US right now for the next 4 years to potentially be leveraging those sort of things. But I get that's a tall order to be asking for. So it's like the more private sector, business savvy, building the right model, solving the right issues, I look at that opportunity as from the entrepreneur perspective of like the saying is cash is oxygen, like it allows you to like do more.
Yeah.
That's been my perspective too. Like as I've had, a little bit more financial security at certain points in my career, I've been able to do more on the side or, partner with other people, work on that side project, etc. So I really think that's it. And so I've kind of like got my fingers crossed that someone in the private sector is going to kick ass, but I don't know who that is. And that could be, like I said, like a skill that you're doing, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Or that could be the next, $1 trillion business idea that hasn't been figured out yet. We need people doing those things.
We're just waiting for that moment. Well, I think it's like I said in the beginning, like somewhere in the conversation, I think knowledge is power here. What I've learned through doing this myself, and I wrote it down here. It's the Dunning-Kruger Effect. I don't know if you've seen that. Also like the quote from Aristotle, like the more that you research things and the more that you actually know that you know nothing. That really hit me personally. And I think if more people start to research this, and that could be like, just like you said, going into other media videos that have been prepared for you, so it's easier to understand. Which also comes down to, and that's not something that we have talked about here, but like the different levels of communication. Like you can talk about the same topic to children, to graduates, to PhDs, all in a different way because people, and also comes down to language. Like how much do you know the language within that topic or that community? There's always ways to get research for yourself. You can talk to other people. You can talk to family members. You can go on Google, whatever. But the more people we have doing that, the more also new ideas can come to us. And that's something like personally, I've always been really interested in creativity. Like with Tom's Odyssey, like my mantra is like the pursuit of creativity. But I really think that creativity is the way out here.